Thank you all for coming to my presentation, and big thanks also to Professor Sturkin and Dr. Hong for inviting me here today, making this trip possible, as well as all the various support staff at the HKU. It's been a great time with all of you so far. So for my presentation, it's titled Platform Tyranny, Rule of Law, and Virtual Community. And I'd like to start with a quick note on the content of this presentation. So I'm going to be mentioning some issues that are related to political violence, harassment, suicide, and LGBTQ mental health, but my presentation isn't going to contain any kinds of graphic depictions or descriptions. So with that said, let's move forward. Okay, so a long-standing concern of political philosophers has been how to avoid tyranny within our societies. And at least provisionally, we can understand tyranny as just a condition of someone or some institutions having arbitrary power over other people's significant interests. So understood, tyranny has historically been considered to make political structures illegitimate, by which I mean they deserve some kind of interference or resistance from the general public. So, for instance, we can find Jean-Jacques Rousseau writing in the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality in the year 1750, the contract of government is so completely dissolved by despotism that the despot is master only so long as he remains the strongest. As soon as he can be expelled, he has no right to complain of violence. Now, if we consider tyranny to be a kind of disease of our political bodies, at least a partial cure is generally recognized to be to make power holders conform to the rule of law. The rule of law is an expansive political ideal that has a variety of different interpretations. But for my purposes, I'm going to understand it in the way that most legal scholars do, which is mainly in procedural terms. So, according to this interpretation, rule of law just is the condition of exerting power only according to rules that are public, fairly applied, and meaningfully contestable. Adopting rule of law isn't going to solve all the problems that we're going to have with power holders in some particular instance, but it's at least generally recognized as contributing to legitimizing power by stopping it from being exercised arbitrarily at its source. And this is an idea that we can find reflected in a lot of the documents that exist within our general background culture. So, for example, in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it says, "It is essential if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law." Now, according to various writers, online platforms that aim to profit from hosting interactions between a variety of users that are drawn from the general public, such as Facebook, X, YouTube, and so forth, are starting to introduce a new source of tyranny into our lives. So, for instance, we can find the political scientist James Muldoon writing in his book, Platform Socialism. We take it for granted that digital platforms should be privately owned fiefdoms that are ruled by a tech despot. Similarly, we can find the journalist Ben Tarnoff in his book, Internet for the People, saying, Facebook's social network of more than 2 billion users is more or less a personal dictatorship. At the same time, we can also often find users treating platforms as illegitimate by taking actions to interfere with them. So, for example, in 2018, many Tumblr users protested the platform's decision to ban non-safe for work content by logging off and refusing to contribute to the site. And the aim of these users in undertaking these actions wasn't just to exercise the rights to free speech and say criticize the platform, but to try and reform it by forcing its owners to change their business practices. So, at least functionally, the relation between platforms and users seems to be analogous to the relation between states and citizens in a way that calls for rule of law. And we also have some people making this relation more explicitly. So we can find this especially among writers within digital constitutionalism. So Nicholas Susor, who's one person writing within this literature, just straightforwardly says, the legitimacy of governance of users by platforms should be evaluated against the values of rule of law. So now, some of these writers that I have up here may, of course, be speaking metaphorically, but metaphors are powerful and they deserve to be examined. And this is especially the case considering the potential of these metaphors to have some kind of impact on changing platform regulation. So, for instance, the EU's Digital Services Act, or DSA, which came into full force for platform users in Europe earlier this year, legally requires all platform moderation decisions to be made according to rules that are public, fairly applied, and also contestable. But since platforms are not states, it's debatable whether these protections should become the norm. Claims that platforms are illegitimate without governing the users by the rule of law suggest that there's reason not only to make these provisions of the DSA standard on platforms beyond Europe, but for publics beyond Europe to moreover demand that this is something that happens. And so this situation for me raises the following question. When is rule of law required for platform legitimacy? Now, required is always a tricky philosophical concept, so I'm going to mean required given feasible interventions on our current social arrangements. Adopting this qualification is going to help us determine when we're on the strongest ground in demanding that platforms restrain their power according to rule of law. And the main thing that I'm going to be arguing for you today is that we should accept what I call the community thesis, which is that platforms are illegitimate unless they govern some virtual communities and their members according to rule of law principles. So here's going to be the plan for the talk going forward. I'm going to examine and then ultimately reject three alternative theses, which I call the maximalist thesis, the financialist thesis, and the information thesis. I'm going to then use these theses to establish the conditions for when rule of law is required for platform legitimacy. I'm next going to argue that some virtual communities fulfill these conditions, and then finally, I'm going to consider the implications for how virtual communities should be structured and regulated, for instance, through policies that are similar to the Digital Services Act. Okay, so since in general, a good way to go about examining a philosophical idea is to take it to its extremes, we can start to understand when it might be that rule of law is required for legitimacy of platforms by considering what I call the maximalist thesis. Platforms are illegitimate unless they govern all users according to rule of law principles. So why might we think that this maximalist thesis is true? Well, you could see this as an outcome of just extending the analogy between platforms and states. A sketch of an argument for this thesis could go something like this. First, platforms, like states, must maintain the order within the digital spaces that they own. And this isn't just to maintain basic platform functionality, but also to protect other people from platform users. So keep in mind that many of the rioters that were involved in the January 6th storming of the US Capitol were ultimately organized by groups that existed on Facebook. Second, maintaining order requires having power over people. For instance, by being able to ban and downrank and suspend accounts, delete and downrank posts, and so forth. Third, an institution has power over people is legitimate only if it's disposed to apply that power justly. And you could accept this premise because, say, you agree with John Rawls that justice is just the first virtue of social institutions. Laws and institutions, no matter how efficient or well arranged, must be reformed or abolished if they are unjust. Fourth, for an institution to be disposed to apply power over people justly, all those subject to it must be governed according to rule of law principles. This premise is plausible because without rule of law, power can be exerted arbitrarily, or in other words, just whenever the power holder feels like it or wants. Being exposed to power of this kind seems to be unjust in itself, but it also frequently has other bad consequences that rule of law helps avoid. So, for instance, arbitrary power makes people unable to plan how their lives go and unable to cooperate with each other in areas that the power holder can end up interfering with. And the constant threat of having power exerted on you arbitrarily is often a source of fear and anxiety for people that are under other people's power. And so now, from these four premises, we can go on to draw the conclusion that platforms are illegitimate unless they govern all users according to rule of law principles. Okay, so here's what I think is at least initially a plausible argument. What should we end up thinking about? Well, I think that this argument can be plausible whenever we modify these premises to apply to states, given the kinds of powers that states have and how expansively they can reach into our lives. But we have good reason to reject some of these premises whenever they're applied to platforms. In particular, I think that we should be suspicious of the fourth premise. There are at least three reasons to think that restricting platforms to exert their power only according to rule of law principles like publicity, fairness, and contestability would in fact result in a situation that's unjust. First, Constraining platforms to exert their power to, say, ban users and delete their content only according to rule of law procedures would decrease how quickly and efficiently platforms can act to avoid harms. So, for instance, the New Zealand Christchurch massacre, in which over 100 people were killed or injured by gunfire, was live streamed by the attacker. Stopping videos of this attack from going viral required that platforms took swift action that sometimes resulted in incorrect decisions. So, for instance, by deleting posts by news organizations that include some graphic images that were taken from this live stream. This overreach seemed to me justified given that the viral spread of the video would have just increased trauma and potentially caused more violence. If platforms were compelled to instead adhere to rule of law principles, then that would mean that they would have to take a more cautious and hesitant approach than they otherwise would when making content moderation decisions in order to address dangerous situations like these. Second, the procedural requirements of rule of law can be misused by shrewd companies to manipulate the perception and behavior of platform users. Giving platform users rule of law protections, such as maybe by offering the means to contest moderation decisions and perhaps forcing platforms to publicize metrics about how fair their decisions are, can make users believe that platforms are overall doing their part to act justly. And platforms can then design these means to contest their decisions just in order to channel complaints through bureaucratic layers and thereby perhaps suddenly steer these users to making outcomes that the platforms themselves most favor. Meanwhile, keeping users' attention fixated on how well platforms are meeting a supposed need to adhere to procedural rule of law requirements can then result in more substantive abuses that platforms are involved with from going unnoticed, such as maybe doing things like facilitating human trafficking or also failing to provide adequate working conditions for their employees. These abuses the platforms are involved with might just be better addressed if we instead increase platforms' legal liability for them, but without offering procedural protections of rule of law for their users. Third, demanding that platforms adopt rule of law protections can be unjust because it benefits large platforms at the expense of small ones. Conforming to rule of law protections is overall costly. Larger, more profitable platforms are going to be able to better bear these costs compared to small ones. And it's been suggested, after all, that this is why platforms like Facebook say that they're in favor of governments imposing regulations that force them to adopt rule of law protections. For these more powerful platforms, such requirements can just be a way for them to hamstring their smaller competitors. So overall, if we're going to demand that any institution restrict its power according to rule of law principles, the drawbacks of doing so are going to have to be justified. The drawbacks associated with making states conform to rule of law are justified given the magnitude and scope of power that they have over all of our lives. Living under the authority of some state or other is a practical necessity for pretty much everyone that's inescapable, and being arrested by the state is something that deprives you of pretty much your entire life. Accordingly, it often strikes people as plausible to adopt something like the English jurist Blackstone's ratio, that it's better for 10 guilty people to go free than for one innocent person to suffer. But when it comes to platforms, the magnitude and scope of power that they have over their users appears to be very different. Being banned from a platform, which is pretty much the worst thing that platform can directly do to you, would seem to leave your entire life intact. Moreover, the further consequences of this decision seem to be in the vast majority of cases trivial because most users have extremely weak ties to platforms. Consider that various studies suggest that something like the 99-1 rule holds when it comes to platforms and their moderation decisions. This means that roughly 1% of people are heavy contributors to platforms, 9% are intermittent contributors, and the rest 90% are just lurkers. That means that they view platform content without contributing at all. As a result, it seems to me like something much like the opposite of Blackstone's ratio hold when it comes to platform moderation decisions. I personally would find it better to ban 10,000 innocent users who merely lurk on or intermittently contribute to a platform than to fail to stop one guilty person from causing some kind of significant abuse. So, to make our argument work, we're going to need to revise our fourth premise. Premise 4 should not claim that all institutional power must be exerted according to rule of law principles in order for an institution to be just. So, what kinds of power are going to have to be constrained by rule of law in order to safeguard justice and so fulfill the necessary conditions for legitimacy? Well, our discussion of states suggests that at least one power of this kind is going to be power over people's vital interests. So let's try adopting the following revised fourth premise. For an institution to be disposed to apply power over people's vital interests justly, all those subject to it must be governed according to rule of law principles. Our aim will then be to find groups that end up meeting this description. Given this revision, I think it's plausible that the argument that we sketched earlier can support the following two theses. So the first is what we might call the financial thesis. Users that rely on platforms for income require rule of law protections for platform legitimacy. So consider Instagram. Last year, Instagram removed its Reels bonus play option for content creators. As a result, many of these content creators end up losing $500 to $1,000 of income a month. And this was money that they, of course, could have been spent on covering life necessities such as covering medical bills or maybe utility costs. The second is the information thesis. Users that rely on platforms for important information require rule of law protections for platform legitimacy. Consider in this case that various Australian health organizations rely on Facebook community pages in order to provide important health information to remote areas. Facebook ended up sparking a lot of backlash when, in 2021, it decided to shut down a variety of these pages just as COVID-19 vaccines were becoming available, and so threatening to deprive a lot of people of important health information. But if we consider these theses, I think it ends up revealing another problem. Revised premise 4 arguably does not remain true under any feasible interventions on our current social arrangements. We can remove arbitrary power by changing background social context. So, for instance, in the book Exit Left, Robert Taylor argues that we can avoid arbitrary power over workers by taking steps like growing markets and having governments provide wider social safety nets. If we took these steps, platforms might still have power over vital interests of workers, but it would become sufficiently easy for workers to satisfy those interests by other means so that the platform does not plausibly become illegitimate of how it uses this power. Similarly, governments can intervene to ensure that people have multiple sources by which to access important information and so don't have to end up relying on a single platform like Facebook. Again, this would mean that Facebook has power over people's vital interests in some kind of immediate sense, but whenever people have to access the platform to gain important information. But once this information is easily accessible by other means, it would mean that the platform does not plausibly become illegitimate because of how it uses this power. All right, so what overall lesson should we draw from this situation? Well, I think it's that premise 4 is still not strong enough. In particular, power holders must also fulfill a no exit condition. Given any feasible interventions on our current social arrangements, goods equivalent to those under the power holder's control can't be accessed elsewhere before incurring some kind of significant harm. This condition doesn't hold for users who currently rely on platforms for income and information because, again, it's arguably feasible that we can just change our background social conditions so that these users can end up being able to acquire equivalent goods elsewhere. Building this condition into our argument is going to then result in a revised fourth premise. For an institution to be disposed to apply power justly over people's vital interests while satisfying the no exit condition, all those subject to it must be governed according to rule of law principles. With this revision, I think that now we have at least the makings of a plausible argument. Power over vital interests that people can't exit makes arbitrary power morally concerning enough to merit the comparison to tyranny and so threaten illegitimacy. What rule of law protections are going to do for us is legitimize power by neutralizing the possibility of its arbitrary exercise at its source. So if we can now go on to establish as a fifth premise that members of some virtual communities are subjected to this kind of power, we can then go on to draw our community thesis as a conclusion. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to argue for this fifth premise. That is, I'm going to argue that some virtual communities provide cases where platforms have power over people's vital interests while also satisfying the no exit condition. So the first thing that we're going to have to do in order to achieve the same is answer the question, what after all is a virtual community? Well, I'm going to follow the sociologist Barry Wellman and just understanding a community to be a network of interpersonal ties that provide sociability, support, information, a sense of belonging, and also social identity. A virtual community is then just going to be a network of this kind that exists through online interactions only or primarily. I'm not going to be concerned with the debate about whether or not virtual communities are in some sense real communities. Instead, I'm going to take an individualistic approach and just focus on what these networks of social interactions provide or do for their members. The first claim I want to establish is that some virtual communities fulfill their members' vital interests. I think that skepticism towards this claim is definitely understandable. Lots of virtual communities seem to be silly or just for fun. So, for instance, if you go to the online platform for virtual communities called School, you can end up joining the Brotherhood of Scent community, and so leverage the power of scent to become the man you know yourself to be. Now, this scent community that we see here fulfills our definition of virtual community. It involves networks of interpersonal ties that provide sociability, support, information, a sense of belonging, and social identity. And yet, I think this mere fact that the scent community fulfills our definition, given that we can assume based on the available information, it's just trivial or just for fun, is going to be insufficient for it to require rule of law protections. But while many and perhaps even most virtual communities don't play more than a trivial role in their members' lives, I think we should disabuse ourselves of the view that this is going to be true of all virtual communities. So consider that Facebook estimates that over 10 million groups exist on its platforms, with over 1.8 billion users active within these groups every month. And various platforms other than Facebook provide services that encourage people to build virtual communities. So given the large number of virtual communities that exist, it's plausible to me that many of them play an important role in fulfilling the vital interests of at least some of their members. And we find some evidence of this reflected in quantitative studies. So for instance, according to a 2020 YouGov online survey of 15,000 individuals, they found that in 11 out of 15 countries, the largest proportion of respondents reported that the most important group in their lives existed primarily online. But I think we're going to find the most convincing evidence in qualitative studies, particularly of LGBTQ communities, immigrant communities, and also health communities. So these studies suggest that some of these communities fulfill their members' interests in having a desire to live. In a qualitative study of 260 transgender youth that was conducted by Ashley Austin and others, they found that participants consistently refer to their online experience with comments like, "Without it, I would probably be dead," "It's life-saving," and "as my saving grace." And so why did these researchers come up with this result? Well, they built a model that was based on the fact that transgender youth face extreme discrimination in their daily face-to-face interactions while being geographically isolated from each other. As a result, some studies indicate that over 80% of transgender people have considered killing themselves and 40% have attempted suicide. What online spaces do is they can provide safety to engage with each other as your authentic self. And this allows for the users of these communities to have experiences that contribute to having a desire to live, such as giving back to others, feeling a sense of hope and belonging. Next, these studies also provide evidence that some virtual communities help fulfill people's interest in accessing critical resources. So in a qualitative study conducted by GovLab, in which they interviewed various leaders of online communities and Facebook groups, they found that moderators or other members of the community African Moms in Deutschland, for instance, commonly offer help to those who are not comfortable speaking German by, for instance, offering to accompany a member to an appointment at a government office in order to help translate. And as you can imagine, for many of these immigrants, having access to this resource could well have made a difference for whether or not something very important to them happened, such as whether or not their visa became approved or denied. Finally, we also have evidence that many virtual communities help fulfill their members' interests in friendship and community, by which, in this particular instance, I'm just mean community as seeing your friends interact together instead of having just one-on-one interactions with individual friends. So, for instance, in the GovLab survey, they said online relationships have spawned long-lasting friendships, even among women who have rarely, if ever, met in person. One participant in the study said, "I feel like I'm a neighbor with the ladies in Frankfurt, even though they're not here with me." And the study by Austin and others had similar results. One participant in this survey said, I felt like I didn't have any friends to talk to. Around this time, I joined Tumblr. It sounds silly, but really has changed my life. Before this, I desperately floated around online chat rooms trying to find someone to talk with. Now I finally feel like I have an actual home online. But one thing we should note is that while satisfying these interests is particularly salient in some particular kinds of communities, such as the ones that I mentioned, they can potentially be fulfilled by any kind of virtual community. So internal research by Facebook indicates that some community members undergo what they call a member journey, in which users initially join a community for its functional or practical benefits, and then over time come to rely on that community more and more for its social benefits. As a result, we can end up getting cases where, say, Facebook group moderators for communities focused on keeping tropical fish have had to respond to some of their members threatening suicide and having to intervene in order to save their lives. And so what this shows to me is that which virtual communities are going to be important for fulfilling the vital interests of their members is something that just can't always be predicted beforehand, even by the members or moderators of these communities themselves. Okay, so the next point that I want to establish is the platforms have arbitrary power over these interests. So many platforms like Facebook can effectively delete your account or deactivate your community for any reason. And although they can be legally compelled to adhere to their terms of service, which might internally place some kind of restrictions on what they can do to your community, we should keep in mind that bringing legal action against platforms for violating these terms is extremely difficult and risky, and these terms themselves are something that platforms can effectively change at will. And this is something that we see reflected in the qualitative studies that I mentioned earlier. A fear of having their communities unilaterally removed is common among Facebook group leaders, according to the GovLab survey that I discussed just a moment ago. And platform users in Europe enjoy more protections from platform power thanks to the Digital Services Act. In this case, the DSA requires that platforms conform to rule of law principles for all moderation decisions that they make, and this includes those that are made against communities themselves. But as I'm going to discuss a little bit later, the DSA does not extend these protections to moderation decisions that are made within the communities themselves, particularly by their administrators and moderators. As a result, the DSA merely restricts the scope of, I think, where arbitrary decisions over vital interests are going to end up occurring on platforms. Okay, the third claim that I want to establish is that some virtual communities also go on to satisfy the no exit condition. So recall that we responded to the financial and information theses by claiming that we can arguably avoid tyranny by making feasible interventions on background social conditions, namely by doing things like expanding social safety nets and also offering alternative resources. The same response, however, is not going to be available whenever it comes to virtual communities. To start, friends and also communities of friends are just a unique good. If you can't access them, there's going to be no other replacement out there. Next, think back to the Austin study that I just discussed. It's going to take time to develop enough trust to feel safe to engage with others as your authentic self. It's also going to take time to develop enough trust in order to share some kind of critical resource, such as time or money, with another person. So people expelled from a community in a moment of vulnerability just simply often won't have enough time to develop the trust that's going to be required to access these critical goods elsewhere, even if we end up arranging markets in order to produce many other virtual communities that might be on hand to offer them. Like the Tumblr user said earlier, they might find themselves simply flowing around the internet, trying to find meaningful connections to replace the ones that they could have found themselves suddenly having lost. And while governments might be able to pick up the slack on providing some of these resources, I don't think it's feasible that we can expect governments to provide absolutely all of them. Furthermore, assuming the hypothetical variety of communities is possible, we can't say that people who are in the market to join a community should always know better than to depend on one that ends up lacking rule of law protections. If Facebook's internal studies are going to be believed, many people can't always anticipate whether they will undertake a member journey and so come to depend on some kind of community for critical social support. Okay, so let's go back to our argument. At this point, I'm going to claim this suffices to establish the fifth premise, and so establish the community thesis. platforms are illegitimate unless they govern some virtual communities and their members according to rule of law principles. So, where does this leave us? Well, keep in mind that the community thesis, in my case, is meant as merely a conditional claim. If platforms are in the business of hosting communities, then their being legitimate requires being prepared to govern some of them according to rule of law. Whether or not legitimate platforms must be in this business in the first place is going to be an interesting question that I'd like to leave aside for future research. As for platforms that do host communities, the community thesis entails that they're going to have to make difficult decisions about whether to grant or revoke rule of law protections for the communities and their members. So it's easy to create nominal virtual communities, and as we saw earlier, mere lurking and occasional use of platforms is by far the norm. So we should expect most virtual communities to not satisfy the vital interests of their members. Consequently, I think that we should hold a presumption against extending virtual communities' rule of law protections. This is especially the case considering that being able to swiftly remove a community can help stop or prevent significant abuse without incurring whatever further harms might be involved with completely removing its members' access to the platform entirely. Communities therefore should have the burden of proving that they deserve rule of law protections, and platforms should provide them the means of relieving this burden. And this is going to end up requiring the platforms publicize criteria for when a community fulfills its members' vital interests, and also give community administrators and moderators ways to gather and submit evidence that these criteria have been met in particular cases. It's also going to require platforms to give regular community members who are not administrators and moderators ways to gather and submit such evidence. And I think this is the case for at least a couple reasons. The first is that general members of a community might have just as much, or maybe even more evidence of how a community fulfills the vital interests of its members than administrators and moderators. The second is that tyranny is not adequately avoided on a platform, even if rule of law protections prevent platform owners and employees from arbitrarily shutting down or moderating communities. Community leaders like administrators and moderators also have the power to remove community members and the content that they post, change community rules, and even disband entire communities, thereby arbitrarily denying these members means to fulfill their vital interests. So I think that adequately avoiding tyranny therefore requires the option of introducing rule of law protections not only against platform operators, but also against community leaders, thereby potentially denying them complete control over the communities that they might have worked very hard to create. This option isn't going to exist unless ordinary community members have the power to advocate for extending rule of law protections within communities on their own, perhaps against the wishes of community leaders. But in general, whether or not a community possesses rule of law protections must have the potential to change throughout the entire life cycle of a community. And this is because communities are something that we should see as dynamic. Communities that play a merely trivial role in the lives of their members can, over time, come to fulfill their vital interests, and ones that initially fulfill their vital interests can also become trivial. And we can also find communities that begin as relatively harmless becoming harmful, and those that begin as harmful becoming harmless. So, for instance, the first online communities for incels, or people that are involuntarily celibate, were initially started by a female Canadian university student in 1997 to provide a supportive and inclusive space for people of all races and genders to discuss their difficulties in finding sexual partners. Incel communities since then have become composed of mostly young white males that are widely criticized for influencing some of their members to commit acts of mass violence. In light of this changeability, platforms are going to have to continually be prepared to assess whether or not any given community should have rule of law protections. And once a platform gains this evidence about whether or not to grant or revoke rule of law protections for a community, its decision is going to become more complicated by the fact that many virtual communities can cause harm, even though perhaps at the same time they end up fulfilling the vital interests of their members. So, for example, members of terrorist organizations and neo-Nazi groups like Stormfront also describe their communities as being homes for them. There are three cases here that you might think are worth distinguishing. Some communities harm their members without harming non-members. So, for instance, thousands of people believe that they suffer from Morgellons disease, which is a rare condition in which the body produces fibers that protrude from sores in the skin. Medical researchers largely doubt that Morgellons exists. If these researchers are right, then Morgellons sufferers may be better overall if platforms ban the virtual communities that just reinforce their beliefs. Next, some communities harm only non-members. Neo-Nazis and terrorist communities are in this category, given that they may very well provide friendship and a sense of belonging for their members, while also encouraging things like hatred and racial violence. Finally, some communities harm both members and non-members. Incel communities are plausibly in this category, given that they encourage the members to believe both self-hating and misogynistic explanations for why they can't find sexual partners. So, given these examples of the kinds of communities that fall under each of these categories, it might appear that the answer to the question of whether there should be extended rule of law protections on platforms is going to be clearly no. Platforms are under no obligation to tolerate groups that not only violate their private terms and conditions, but that moreover break laws and perhaps violate other people's rights. I want to be clear that I completely agree with this claim. Yet, platforms might be under no obligation to tolerate these communities and at the same time also be obligated to grant them rule of law protections. This is because rule of law protections do not make a community immune from platform power. Instead, what they do is they restrict the platform to exerting its power on communities according to rules that are public, contestable, and fairly applied. So, rule of law protections are better thought of as procedural requirements for how platforms can be intolerant of the communities that exist under their authority. So, at this point, stressing the procedural nature of rule of law might instead lead one to think that the answer to the question of whether or not harmful communities should have rule of law protections is going to be clearly yes. After all people have a right to due process. And this right is going to require that even people who are obviously guilty of the most vicious crimes should be arrested and tried according to non-arbitrary and fair procedures. So it would seem that all virtual communities and their users, no matter how harmful they might be, should be granted rule of law protections in order to respect their rights to due process. But the problem with this line of reasoning is that platform moderation decisions are not legal systems. Decisions to ban users or delete content that they post are not punishments. They're not handed down in retribution for wrongs done in order to teach those who receive them some kind of lesson. And the mere fact that a user received these decisions, I think, should not be a reason for them to receive the same kind of social stigma that often attaches to people found guilty in civil or criminal courts. Moderations are instead practical decisions and interventions that stop or prevent harm, violations of the law, or threats to the order that platforms want to impose on their property. So, seen in this light, my view is that the overriding consideration about whether or not to grant or revoke rule of law protections for harmful communities is in every case whether harming their members by suddenly depriving them the means offered by a community to satisfy their vital interests would be a proportionate response to the harms that are caused by the community. If this is the case, communities without rule of law protections should not be given them, and communities with rule of law protections should have them revoked, and vice versa if not. So let's apply this principle to some of the cases that we just saw above. Suppose that a terrorist community that aims to destroy a city satisfies its members' interests in friendship. This community should not have rule of law protections because depriving its member of friendship would be a proportionate response to the harms that are involved with destroying an entire city. Next, suppose that Morgellons disease does not exist, but that those who believe that they suffered from it are able to maintain a desire to live through giving each other some kind of support within the Morgellons disease community. Suppose at the same time that this community causes harm because its members encourage each other to waste money on treatments to disease that we should assume are themselves harmless. I think that this community should have rule of law protections because depriving its members of the desire to live would not be a proportionate response to the harm of merely wasting money. Following this proportionality principle in deciding whether to grant or revoke rule of law protections may well result in more harm being done by communities compared to if they were directly exposed to platform power. Although this situation would be unfortunate, I think it's one that we often find ourselves prepared to accept in other cases. So consider the relation between a landlord and tenant. The tenant may well be causing moderate harm to other tenants or damaging the landlord's property. The harms in this case and similar ones might well be minimized if landlords in general were given the authority to evict their tenants whenever they felt like it. But considering the importance of housing for well-being and also the difficulty of finding alternatives on short notice, giving landlords this authority would be tantamount to creating a condition of tyranny that I think many of us are not prepared to accept. Similarly, my view is that we should consider it unacceptable for platform users to be deprived of their virtual homes that communities provide for them at the will of platform owners. Now, assuming that my view is correct, a further consequence is that we should consider legislation like the Digital Services Act as being both too strong and too weak. It's too strong because it requires platforms to extend rule of law protections to all platform users and communities, even if these users have only weak interest in accessing and contributing to platforms, and the communities that they're members of provide them only trivial goods. And legislation like the DSA is also too weak, because while it affords protections from platform power, it gives users no protection from community administrators and moderators, even when the communities that they oversee can be fulfilling the vital interests of their members. Legislation that's compatible with my view would instead require platforms to be more sensitive to the variety and nuance of relationships that the users have with the digital spaces that they control. Such legislation would demand much more of platforms than what we do of states and other authoritative structures in the non-digital parts of the world. But I see this as just a consequence of the kind of things that platforms are. Platforms have a capacity to surveil and control their users in much more fine-grained detail than what states can achieve with their citizens. This in turn means that we can demand that platforms achieve a form of justice that is much more fine-grained than what we can end up demanding of states. At the same time, whether perpetrated by states or platforms, tyranny should be everywhere avoided. One way to achieve this is by requiring platforms to use their capacities to determine which virtual communities satisfy their members' vital interests. When appropriate, platforms should provide their members rule of law protections, thereby shielding them from the arbitrary exercises of power, both from the platform and also from within virtual communities themselves. Thank you.